The cemetery on the hillside was the quietest place in the city, which was why Nadia Sorel liked to go there on Sunday mornings to sketch. She had discovered it by accident 6 months ago, cycling through the outskirts of the city looking for a particular quality of light that she needed for a series of botanical illustrations she was developing for a client's full-sleeve tattoo. The cemetery had appeared at the top of a winding road, gated and private, surrounded by iron fencing and bare trees that in winter looked like charcoal drawings against the gray sky. She had stopped her bicycle at the gate and looked through the iron bars and seen rows of headstones stretching up the hillside, some old and weathered, some new and polished, all of them silent in the particular way that only cemeteries and libraries and empty churches are silent. For a deaf woman, silence was not the absence of sound. Silence was her native language, the medium through which she experienced everything. She did not miss sound the way hearing people assumed she did, because she had never possessed it. She had been born profoundly deaf, had grown up in a world of visual information and vibration, and the extraordinary sensitivity that develops when one sense is absent and the others compensate. She read lips the way other people read books, fluently, automatically, with the ability to extract meaning from the shapes of mouths and the tension of jaws and the micro-expressions that accompanied speech like punctuation. The cemetery became her Sunday ritual. She would arrive at dawn before anyone else, prop her bicycle against the iron gate and find a spot among the headstones where the light was good and the angles were interesting. She would sit on the cold ground with her sketchbook in her lap and her ink pens arranged beside her, and she would draw. She drew the headstones, the trees, the iron fencing, the way the morning light fell across the marble surfaces and created shadows that looked like calligraphy. She drew the flowers that people left, wilting roses, fresh lilies, plastic arrangements that would never die but would never truly live either. She drew the quiet. It was on her 7th Sunday visit that she first saw the man. He arrived in a black car that moved through the cemetery's private road with the controlled speed of someone who came here regularly. The car was expensive, but not ostentatious, a dark sedan with tinted windows that reflected the gray sky. It stopped near the upper section of the cemetery, where the newer headstones were, where the graves were maintained with the meticulous attention that suggested money and grief in equal measure. A man got out of the car. He was tall, very tall, with broad shoulders and the angular build of someone who had lost weight he could not afford to lose. He wore a black overcoat that fell past his knees and dark clothing underneath. Even from 30 meters away, where Nadia sat with her sketchbook behind a row of older headstones, she could see that this man carried himself with the particular weight of someone who was both powerful and exhausted by power. He moved the way large animals move, with an economy of motion that suggested contained force, the ability to be still or explosive depending on what the moment required. He walked to a grave near the top of the hill. The headstone was black marble, polished with white flowers arranged at its base, fresh flowers replaced recently. He stood before the headstone with his hands at his sides and his head slightly bowed, and he stood there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just standing in the cold morning air, with the gray sky above him and the dead beneath his feet. Nadia watched him because watching was what she did. She watched the world with the intensity of someone who had to extract all information through her eyes alone. She watched the way his shoulders held tension, the way his jaw was clenched, the way his hands opened and closed at his sides as if they wanted to hold something that was no longer there. She watched the grief in his posture, which was as legible to her as any spoken word. And then he began to speak. He spoke to the headstone. He spoke to the dead woman whose name was carved into the black marble. He spoke with the unself-conscious honesty of a man who believed he was completely alone, who believed that the only audience for his words was someone who could no longer hear them. But Nadia could read his lips. She had not intended to. She had not positioned herself to eavesdrop, had not chosen her sketching spot with any awareness that someone would come to this part of the cemetery and begin speaking secrets to a grave. She was simply sitting where she always sat, and he was standing 30 meters away, and his face was turned at an angle that gave her a clear view of his mouth, and her eyes did what they always did. They read. "I know who killed you, Mara." The words formed on his lips with the slow precision of someone who had said them before, who said them every week, who came to this grave every Sunday and repeated this confession like a prayer that could not be heard by anyone who mattered. "I've known for 7 months. Victor, it was Victor. He ordered the bomb because you found his accounts, because you were going to tell me what he'd been stealing, and he couldn't let that happen. He killed you, and he let Alexei take the blame, and I destroyed Alexei's operation based on a lie." Nadia's hand stopped moving on the page. The pen left a trail of ink across her sketch where it dragged, a dark line that ruined the drawing, but she did not notice because every atom of her attention was focused on the man's mouth, on the words forming there, on the devastating confession being delivered to a woman made of marble in memory. And, "I can't expose him, Mara. If I reveal that Victor killed you, my entire organization collapses. Every alliance, every agreement, every operation, it's all built on the foundation that I avenged you by destroying Alexei. If the truth comes out, if people learn that I've been protecting your killer for 7 months because I can't afford the consequences of exposing him, I lose everything. And Victor knows it. He knows I know, and he knows I can't act on it, and he sits across from me at meetings and calls me brother, and I let him because the alternative is chaos." The man's face contorted with something that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but something older and more corrosive than either. It was the expression of a man being consumed by a truth he could not speak aloud, a truth that was eating him from the inside, a truth he could only confess to someone who would never repeat it. "I'm sorry, Mara. I'm sorry I'm not strong enough to do what you would want me to do. I'm sorry I'm protecting the man who took you from me because protecting him is the only way to keep what you helped me build. I'm sorry I come here every week and tell you the truth and then go back into the world and live the lie." He pressed his hand against the headstone, his palm flat against the cold marble, and he stood there with his eyes closed and his lips still moving, forming words that Nadia could no longer read because his face had turned away from her. And she sat behind her row of headstones, with her heart hammering and her ruined sketch in her lap, and the full weight of what she had just witnessed pressing down on her like a physical force. She had read a confession. She had read a secret that a Mafia boss had spoken only to the dead. She had accidentally become the only living person who knew the truth about a murder that had reshaped the criminal landscape of the entire city, and she had no idea what to do with it. Nadia left the cemetery that morning with her hands trembling so badly she could barely grip her bicycle handlebars. She rode back to the city through the gray morning, through streets that were just beginning to fill with Sunday traffic, past bakeries and cafes where people sat with newspapers and coffee and no knowledge that a woman on a bicycle was carrying a secret that could get her killed. She went to her studio. Silent Ink was closed on Sundays, but the space was hers, and she needed to be somewhere familiar, somewhere she could think. She locked the door behind her, sat in her tattoo chair, the one she used for clients, the one that reclined and supported and held you while someone drew on your skin with needles. And she stared at the ceiling and tried to process what had happened. She knew who the man was. Everyone in the city knew who Nikolai Volkov was. His face appeared in newspapers, on television, in the whispered conversations of people who knew enough to be afraid. He controlled the northern territories. He was connected to operations that moved through the port and the industrial district and the financial centers where legitimate money and criminal money mixed so thoroughly that no one could tell the difference anymore. His wife, Mara, had been killed in a car bombing 2 years ago, and the bombing had been attributed to Alexei Petrov, a rival whose operation Nikolai had subsequently dismantled with a thoroughness that had become legendary in the criminal underworld. Except that was a lie. Alexei Petrov had not killed Mara Volkov. Viktor Zelenko had killed her. Nikolai's own second in command, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him at the funeral, had ordered the bomb that killed the woman Nikolai loved. And Nikolai knew. And he was protecting Viktor because the truth would destroy his empire. And Nadia knew because she could read lips, because she had been sitting in a cemetery sketching headstones on a Sunday morning, because the universe had decided that a deaf tattoo artist was the appropriate repository for a secret that could reshape the power dynamics of an entire city. If this story is already pulling you in, if you can feel the weight of what Nadia just witnessed and you need to know what happens next, take a second to subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales. Hit that notification bell because this story is about to take turns you will not see coming. She told no one. For 2 weeks, she went about her life as if nothing had changed. She opened the studio at 10 every morning, tattooed clients until 7 in the evening, ate dinner alone in her apartment with Phantom the cat, curled in her lap, and tried to pretend that the knowledge inside her head was not burning a hole through her consciousness. But it was. The secret was corrosive. It sat in her mind the way ink sits under skin, permanently, irrevocably, changing the surface of everything. She found herself distracted during sessions, her usual laser focus disrupted by the intrusion of words that formed on repeat in her memory. I know who killed you, Mara. Viktor. It was Viktor. The 2 weeks that followed were a study in the art of pretending. Nadia opened silent ink every morning at 10, unlocking the glass door with its hand-painted sign, the name rendered in her own calligraphy, the letters dripping slightly as if the ink were still wet, and she went through the familiar rituals of preparation. She sterilized her equipment, arranged her ink caps in neat rows of color, queued up the day's appointments on her tablet, and brewed coffee in the small kitchen at the back of the studio that also served as her break room, her storage closet, and Phantom's secondary napping location. Her clients came and went. A college student wanting her first tattoo, a small crescent moon behind her ear that took 20 minutes and would become the gateway to a full sleeve within 3 years. Nadia could already see it. A middle-aged man adding to the memorial piece on his shoulder for his mother, her birth and death, dates framed by forget-me-nots. A young couple getting matching tattoos, a compass on his wrist, and a North Star on hers, and Nadia had tattooed enough matching pieces to know the statistical likelihood of those symbols outlasting the relationship. But she kept that observation to herself, because hope was not hers to manage. She communicated with her clients through a combination of written notes, a tablet with pre-typed phrases, and the universal language of gesture and expression. Most people were nervous at first, not because she was deaf, but because they were about to let someone permanently mark their bodies. And by the end of their sessions, they had forgotten about her deafness entirely, which was exactly how she preferred it. She did not want to be the deaf tattoo artist. She wanted to be the extraordinary tattoo artist who happened to be deaf. But during those 2 weeks, her concentration faltered. Her hand, usually as steady as a surgeon's, developed a tremor so slight that only she could detect it, a hesitation at the beginning of each line, a fraction of a second where her focus fragmented between the skin beneath her needle and the words that played on loop in her memory. She caught herself staring at her clients' mouths, reading their nervous chatter without interest, overlaying their mundane words with the shape of Nikolai Volkov's lips forming. I know who killed you, Mara. Viktor. It was Viktor. She went running 3 times during those 2 weeks, pounding through the industrial district at dawn, her feet hitting the pavement in a rhythm she could feel but not hear. She ran along the waterfront where the fishing boats rocked in the gray water and the gulls screamed silently above her, and the city woke in increments. Lights in apartment windows, delivery trucks making their rounds, the homeless man who slept under the bridge near her studio, shuffling into wakefulness. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, and the physical exhaustion temporarily crowded out the mental noise, which was a strange thing to call it for a woman who lived in silence, but there it was. The secret made noise inside her head, a constant pressure, a humming vibration that would not stop. Phantom noticed the change. The cat had an unsettling ability to detect shifts in Nadia's emotional state, and during those 2 weeks he abandoned his usual perch on the windowsill and took to sleeping on her chest at night. His weight a warm anchor, his purring, which she could feel as a deep vibration against her sternum, the closest thing to a lullaby that her world offered. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling of her apartment, the drawings of Nikolai already beginning to accumulate on the wall across the room, though she didn't yet realize what they meant, and she would run the confession through her mind again and again, frame by frame, lip movement by lip movement, searching for ambiguity and finding none. She considered her options with the methodical clarity of a woman who had spent her entire life solving problems that the hearing world never thought to present her with. She could go to the police, but the police in this city had a complicated relationship with the Volkov organization, and a deaf woman claiming to have read a confession from a Mafia boss's lips at a gravesite would be believed by precisely no one. She could attempt to contact Viktor Zelenko directly, but that was suicide dressed in courage, and Nadia had too much self-respect for martyrdom. She could simply forget what she had read, seal the knowledge behind a wall in her mind, and go about her life as if she had never sat in a cemetery and watched a man confess murder to a headstone. But forgetting was not something Nadia did well. Her visual memory was extraordinary, a byproduct of a life lived through the eyes, every important piece of information arriving through sight and stored with photographic precision. She could recall faces she had seen once, 15 years ago. She could reproduce a tattoo design she had glimpsed on a stranger's forearm in a coffee shop. She could close her eyes and see the exact shape of Nikolai Volkov's mouth, forming the name Victor, the way his upper lip curled slightly on the V, the way his jaw tightened on the K, the way the word seemed to taste like poison, even though he was the one choosing to swallow it. She could not forget. The only question was what she would do with what she could not stop remembering. She returned to the cemetery the following Sunday. She told herself she was going to sketch, that the cemetery was her place, that she had been coming here before him and had no reason to stop. She told herself she would choose a different spot, further from his wife's grave, where she could not see his face even if he came. But she went to the same spot, and he came at the same time, and she watched. This time he spoke less. He replaced the white flowers at the base of the headstone with fresh ones he had brought in a paper bag. He knelt on the ground beside the grave and arranged the flowers with a care that seemed incongruous with everything Nadia knew about who he was. The hands that placed white roses against black marble were the same hands that had built a criminal empire, that had ordered the destruction of rivals, that carried the weight of violence in their scarred knuckles, and yet they placed flowers with the gentleness of a man who had loved someone deeply and could not stop performing acts of devotion, even though the recipient was beyond receiving them. He spoke again. His lips moved, and Nadia read them. Victor is getting bolder, Mara. He's making decisions without consulting me. He's meeting with people I haven't approved. He thinks because I know the truth and haven't acted, that I'm weak. He thinks he owns me now, that my silence is his guarantee of safety. And maybe he's right. Maybe keeping his secret has made me weak. Maybe the lie I'm living is the thing that's going to destroy everything, not the truth. He paused. His hand rested on the headstone. I miss you. I miss the way you would have told me what to do. You always knew. You always saw through the complexity to the simple truth underneath. You would have said something like, Nikolai, the truth is never the wrong choice, even when it's the expensive one. And you would have been right. You were always right. Nadia sat behind her headstones and read his grief and his guilt and his paralysis, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Compassion, not pity. She had no patience for pity, not for herself and not for anyone else, but compassion. The recognition that this man, for all his power and violence, and the fear he inspired, was trapped in a cage built of loyalty and love and the inability to reconcile the two. She understood being trapped. She had spent her entire life in a body that the world treated as limited, as broken, as something to be accommodated rather than celebrated. She had learned to navigate that cage, to find freedom within its constraints, to build a life that was full and purposeful, despite the constant assumptions of hearing people who looked at her deafness and saw deficiency rather than difference. She knew what it was like to carry something that other people could not see, that shaped every interaction, that determined who stayed and who left. On the third Sunday, something changed. Nadia arrived early, as usual, and took her position behind the row of older headstones. She opened her sketchbook and began to draw, her pen moving across the paper with the automatic fluency of someone who has drawn 10,000 hours of lines and curves and shadows. She was drawing the iron gate at the cemetery entrance, the way the morning light caught the scrollwork and turned it into something that looked more like art than infrastructure. Nikolai arrived at his usual time. Black car, dark overcoat, the measured walk of a man carrying the world's weight on his shoulders. He went to Mara's grave. He replaced the flowers. He knelt, and then he looked directly at Nadia. The shock of his gaze meeting hers was like a physical impact. His gray-blue eyes, pale as winter sky, found her across 30 meters of cemetery ground, and she understood immediately that he had known she was there. Not just today. Every time. He had known about the woman with the sketchbook behind the headstones, had known about her presence, had calculated her distance and her angle, and had determined that she was too far away to hear his whispered confessions. But he did not know she was deaf. He did not know she could read lips. He did not know that his distance-calculated safety margin was meaningless against a woman who extracted language from the movement of mouths. He stood and walked toward her. Nadia's first instinct was to run. Every survival mechanism she possessed told her to grab her sketchbook and her pens and get on her bicycle and ride away from this man who killed people and kept secrets, and was now walking toward her with the controlled gait of a predator who had spotted something out of place in his territory. But she did not run. She stayed where she was, sitting on the cold ground with her sketchbook in her lap, and she watched him approach, and she felt her heart hammering in a chest that produced no sound, in a body that existed in permanent silence, and she waited. He stopped 3 meters away. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the moment stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. He spoke. She read his lips. "You've been here every week. Who are you?" Nadia reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. She opened the Notes app and typed quickly, then turned the screen toward him. "I'm deaf. I come here to sketch. I'm not following you." She watched his expression change. The suspicion did not disappear, but it shifted, recalibrated by this new information. His eyes moved from her phone to her face, studying her with the analytical intensity of a man accustomed to reading people for threats. She could see him processing the implications. Deaf meant she could not have heard him speaking. Deaf meant his words at the grave were safe. Deaf meant she was not a threat. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet. "You're an artist," he said, and she read his lips and nodded. He gestured toward her sketchbook, a question without words. "May I see?" She hesitated, then handed it to him. He turned the pages slowly, and she watched his face as he looked at her drawings. The headstones, the trees, the iron fencing, the flowers. His expression shifted again, from suspicion to something that looked like appreciation, the recognition of skill, of someone who saw the world with unusual clarity and translated what they saw onto paper with precision and beauty. "These are extraordinary," he said, and she read his lips, and felt a warmth in her chest that she did not want to feel, because accepting a compliment from a man like Nikolai Volkov was the beginning of something she could not afford to begin. He returned the sketchbook and looked at her for a long moment. "I come here every Sunday," he said, "to visit my wife. I prefer to be alone." Nadia typed on her phone. "I was here first. I'll stay out of your way, but I'm not leaving. This is the best light in the city for drawing." Something happened on his face that might have been the ghost of a smile. He nodded once, turned, and walked back to his wife's grave. And Nadia sat with her sketchbook and her pounding heart and understood that something had shifted, that the invisible wall between them had developed a crack, and that cracks, once started, had a tendency to spread. Every moment of this story is building towards something you won't expect. If you're feeling the tension, if you can feel the danger of what Nadia knows and the impossible situation she's in, hit that like button and drop a comment. Subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales if you haven't already, because this story is only getting more intense from here. They existed in parallel for 3 more Sundays. She sketched. He visited the grave. They did not interact beyond brief nods of acknowledgement, his a controlled dip of the chin, hers a quick lift of her pen in something between a wave and a salute. But Nadia was aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with the secret she carried, and everything to do with the way he moved through the cemetery, the way he knelt beside his wife's grave with a tenderness that contradicted everything the world believed about him. The 4th Sunday was bitterly cold. Frost had turned the cemetery into a landscape of glass, every surface coated with a thin crystalline layer that caught the weak winter sunlight and scattered it into fragments. Nadia wore fingerless gloves so she could still hold her pen, and she drew the frost patterns on the headstones, intricate, temporary, beautiful in the way that only temporary things can be. Her breath made clouds in the cold air, and she watched Nikolai arrive in his black car and walk to Mara's grave and kneel on the frozen ground without flinching, his knees pressing into ice-crusted earth as if discomfort were irrelevant, as if pain were just another language he had learned to speak fluently. He spoke to Mara that morning about the beginning of their relationship. Nadia read his lips from her distance, her eyes doing what they always did, extracting words from the movement of his mouth with an efficiency that bordered on compulsive. He told Mara about the first time he saw her at a gallery opening in the old quarter, how she had been standing in front of an abstract painting with her head tilted to one side, and he had watched her for 10 minutes before approaching, because he wanted to memorize the way she looked before she knew he existed. He told her about their first conversation, how she had challenged him on his opinion of the painting. He had called it pretentious, and she had laughed and said that calling art pretentious was the most pretentious thing a person could do, and how that laugh had rearranged something inside his chest that had never been properly arranged in the first place. Nadia's pen stopped moving on the page. She sat with her sketchbook cooling in the winter air and absorbed the intimacy of this confession, the tenderness of a man describing love to the woman he had lost, and she felt the familiar ache of voyeurism, the discomfort of witnessing something she had no right to witness, paired with the inability to look away. The 5th Sunday was overcast but warmer, the kind of gray day that the city specialized in, where the clouds sat so low they seemed to rest on the rooftops, like a ceiling that had been lowered to create intimacy. Nadia drew the bare branches of the cemetery's oldest tree, a massive elm that had been there for a century and had watched generations of grief unfold beneath its canopy. She drew it slowly, carefully, each branch a study in the way things persist through seasons of loss and still find the strength to produce leaves when spring returns. Nikolai's confession that day was different. He spoke about guilt, not the guilt of knowing Victor's secret and keeping it, but an older guilt, a foundational guilt that had been with him since before Mara, since before the organization, since the first time he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He told the headstone about a man named Petrov, a different Petrov from Alexei, an older man, a mentor figure, who had trusted Nikolai and whom Nikolai had betrayed in the process of building his empire. He said the name with a weight that suggested it was one he rarely spoke aloud, a name he had buried under years of justification and pragmatic necessity. "You knew about him, Mara," he said, and Nadia read the words through the gray afternoon light. "You were the only person I ever told, and you held it for me. You held all my sins, and they didn't make you leave. And now I've got no one to hold them, and they're getting heavy." Nadia felt the weight of his words settle into her own bones. She understood the burden of carrying things alone. She had carried her deafness through a world built for hearing people, had carried the daily microaggressions of strangers who spoke louder instead of clearer, who mouthed words with exaggerated slowness as if she were stupid rather than deaf, who turned away mid-sentence because they forgot she needed to see their lips. She had carried the loneliness of parties where everyone talked too fast for her to follow, of family gatherings where the conversation moved like a river that she stood beside but could never quite enter. She knew what it was like to carry weight without anyone to share it with. She knew what it was like to smile and nod and pretend you were not drowning. The sixth Sunday brought fog. The cemetery disappeared into whiteness, and Nadia drew blind, sketching from memory rather than observation, recreating the headstones and the paths and the iron fencing from the accumulated knowledge of weeks of careful looking. It was the first time she had drawn without her subject in front of her, and the results surprised her. The drawings were more emotional, less precise, infused with a quality that her observation-based work lacked. They looked like memory feels, slightly blurred at the edges, sharper in the places that mattered. Nikolai came despite the fog. She could barely see him through the white wall of moisture, but she could make out his silhouette at Mara's grave, and when he spoke, the fog thinned just enough for her to catch fragments. Victor, meetings, Eastern Territory, power. The word afraid appeared on his lips for the first time, and it shocked her because she had not imagined that Nikolai Volkov was capable of fear. But there it was, shaped by his mouth and delivered to the dead, and intercepted by a woman who could not hear it, but could see it with devastating clarity. She read his lips each Sunday, not because she was trying to, but because her eyes were drawn to his face, the way they were drawn to any face that was speaking, the way a hearing person's ears are drawn to sound. It was involuntary, automatic, as natural as breathing. And each Sunday, the words he spoke to Mara revealed another layer of a man who was far more complicated than the monster the newspapers made him out to be. And he spoke about Victor. Each Sunday, the references to Victor became more urgent, more frustrated. Victor was consolidating power behind Nikolai's back. Victor was meeting with contacts in the Eastern Territories without authorization. Victor was testing boundaries, pushing limits, behaving like a man who believed he was untouchable because he held the ultimate leverage, the knowledge that Nikolai knew the truth and would not act on it. Nadia listened with her eyes and carried the weight of what she learned, and she began to draw Nikolai. Not in the cemetery, not while he could see her, but at night in her apartment, from memory. She drew his face in ink on heavy paper, capturing the sharp Slavic features, the pale eyes, the scar through his lower lip, the way grief had carved lines into a face that was too young for them. She drew him the way she drew everything, with precision and attention and the particular intimacy that comes from looking at something so carefully that it becomes part of you. She drew him in profile first, the view she knew best from the cemetery. His jaw sharp against the gray sky, his eyes fixed on the headstone, the wolf tattoo visible on the side of his neck. Then she drew him from the front, recreating his face from the moment he had looked directly at her on that third Sunday. And the intensity of those pale eyes on paper was almost as unsettling as it had been in person. She drew his hands, those scarred, contradictory hands that placed flowers with gentleness and had built an empire with force. She drew the way his shoulders held grief, the specific angle of his head when he spoke to Mara, the way his whole body seemed to lean toward the headstone, as if gravity were pulling him not down, but toward her, always toward her, toward the woman who was gone. The drawings accumulated. She pinned them to the wall above her desk, and Phantom the cat observed them from the windowsill with feline indifference, and Nadia sat in her silent apartment surrounded by images of a man she should have been afraid of, and felt instead a complicated tangle of emotions that she could not name and did not want to examine too closely. She told herself it was artistic fascination, the same impulse that made her draw anyone with an interesting face. She told herself the drawings were a professional exercise in capturing grief and strength and contradiction in a single set of features. She told herself these things with the firm conviction of a woman who knew she was lying to herself, but was not yet ready to admit what the truth was. On the 7th Sunday, it rained. Nadia arrived at the cemetery soaked, her sketchbook wrapped in a plastic bag to keep it dry, her hair plastered to her face, her combat boots squelching in the mud. The rain was heavy and cold, the kind of rain that turned the cemetery into a gray watercolor, blurring the edges of everything, making the headstones look like they were melting into the earth. She did not expect Nikolai to come. No one came to a cemetery in this kind of rain. She sat up under a large oak tree that provided some shelter and began to draw the rain-washed landscape, the headstones through the curtain of water, the way the rain made everything look like a memory of itself. But he came. The black car appeared on the private road, and he got out, and he did not have an umbrella. He walked through the rain to Mara's grave, and the water soaked through his overcoat and his hair and ran down his face, and he did not seem to notice or care because the rain was just another form of the grief that was already drenching him from the inside. He replaced the flowers. He knelt in the mud, and then he looked toward the oak tree, toward Nadia, and instead of turning back to the grave, he walked toward her. He stood under the oak tree, dripping, his pale eyes meeting hers. He was close enough now that she could read his lips without straining, close enough that she could see the individual drops of rain on his eyelashes, close enough that the space between them felt charged with something that had been building for 7 weeks. He spoke, and she read. "Why do you come here in the rain?" She typed on her phone, holding it under the shelter of her jacket to keep it dry. "Why do you?" That ghost of a smile again, barely there, gone before it fully formed. "Because the dead don't care about weather." She typed, "Neither do I." He looked at her phone, then at her face, then at the sketchbook in her lap. "You're drawing the rain," he said. She nodded. "Can I watch?" She moved over on the exposed root she was using as a seat, making space. He sat beside her, this man who controlled the Northern Territories, who had killed and ordered killings, who carried a secret that was slowly destroying him, and he watched her draw. He watched her hands move across the paper, translating the gray, rain-soaked cemetery into ink lines that captured something essential about the place, something that photography would miss, and that only a human hand with a human eye could convey. They sat under the oak tree for an hour. When the rain eased, he stood, looked at her drawing, and said something that she read with a precision that cut through her chest like one of her own tattoo needles. "You see things that other people don't," she typed. "That's what happens when you can't hear. You learn to see everything instead." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "I want you to tattoo something for me." The request surprised her. She typed, "What?" "My wife's name. On my chest. Over my heart. I've been thinking about it for 2 years, but I haven't trusted anyone to do it right. Your drawings tell me you would do it right." Nadia looked at this man standing in the rain in a cemetery, asking her to permanently inscribe his dead wife's name on his body, and she understood that this was not simply a tattoo request. This was an act of trust that a man like Nikolai Volkov did not extend to strangers. He was offering her access to his body, to his grief, to the vulnerability that existed beneath the armor of his reputation. She typed, "Come to my studio, Tuesday, 2 o'clock. He nodded, and then he walked back through the rain to his car, and Nadia sat under the oak tree and stared at the words she had typed on her phone and wondered what she was doing, what she was beginning, what kind of danger she was walking toward with her eyes wide open and her heart beating in silence. He came to Silent Ink on Tuesday at exactly 2 o'clock. He came alone, which her research had told her was unusual. Nikolai Volkov did not go anywhere without security. He walked through the studio door, and the bell above it vibrated in a way that Nadia could feel through the floor, and she came from the back room to find him standing among her flash art and her framed designs, looking at her work with the same careful attention he gave to everything. He was wearing a dark turtleneck and black trousers, and without the overcoat, he looked leaner, more human, more like a man, and less like a force. She could see the wolf tattoo on his neck more clearly, and the Cyrillic script at his collarbone, and she noticed that his hands, which were large and scarred, were trembling slightly. She guided him to the tattoo chair. She had already designed the tattoo based on what he had asked for. Mara's name in a script that she'd developed specifically for this piece, elegant and organic, surrounded by a subtle framework of thorns that represented protection, that represented the lengths he had gone to in order to guard his love for her, even after she was gone. She showed him the design on her tablet. He looked at it for a long time, and something in his face fractured, a crack in the granite of his composure, and she saw his jaw tighten against the emotion that was trying to escape. "It's perfect," he said, and she read his lips and felt the weight of his approval like a physical thing. She prepped his skin. She positioned the stencil, and then she began to tattoo, and the room was silent. Silent for him because neither of them spoke. Silent for her because the world was always silent, and the only movement was her hand, and the machine, and the ink entering his skin, letter by letter, Mara's name being written permanently on the body of the man who had loved her and lost her and was carrying the truth of her death like a stone in his chest. She worked for an hour and a half. During that time, she was close enough to his face to read every expression that crossed it, every micro movement of his features, every flicker of pain and memory and grief that the tattoo was bringing to the surface. She was close enough to see the tears that gathered in his pale eyes and did not fall, held back by a will that had been forged in decades of refusing to show weakness. When she finished, she held up a mirror so he could see the result. Mara's name, in her careful script, surrounded by the delicate thorns positioned over his heart. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Nadia, and what she saw in his face was gratitude so vast and so raw that it seemed to alter the temperature of the room. "Thank you," he said, and the simplicity of the words on his lips carried more weight than any elaborate speech could have. She typed on her phone. "She must have been extraordinary." "She was," he said. "She was the only person who ever made me want to be better than I am." Nadia looked at this man sitting in her tattoo chair with his dead wife's name fresh on his skin and the truth about her murder locked behind his teeth, and she made a decision that she would later recognize as the moment everything changed. She typed, "I need to tell you something, and you're going to want to be sitting down for it, which is convenient because you already are." He looked at her phone. He looked at her face. His expression shifted from grief to alertness, the transition instantaneous, a predator recognizing a change in the environment. She typed the next words, carefully, deliberately, knowing that they would detonate like a bomb in the small, quiet space of her tattoo studio. "I can read lips. I've been reading yours at the cemetery for 7 weeks. I know about Victor. I know he killed Mara. I know you've been protecting him because the truth would destroy your organization." The silence in the room became something else. It became a void, a vacuum, the absence not just of sound, but of everything. Trust, safety, the fragile connection that had been building between them for 7 Sundays in a cemetery and 1 afternoon in a tattoo chair. Nikolai's face went through a sequence of expressions so rapid that even Nadia's trained eyes struggled to track them. Shock, fear, rage, and then something she did not expect. Devastation. The look of a man who has been carrying an unbearable weight alone and has just discovered that someone else has been watching him carry it. "You know," he said, and his lips barely moved on the words. She typed, "I know. And I haven't told anyone, and I won't. But you need to know that I know, because carrying your secret without your knowledge isn't fair to either of us." He stood up from the tattoo chair. He was large in the small space of the studio, and for a moment Nadia felt the full force of who he was, the danger he represented, the reality that she had just told a Mafia boss that she had been reading his private confessions for nearly 2 months. She had just made herself a threat. She had just given him every reason to eliminate her. But he did not move toward her. He moved toward the window, and he stood there with his back to her, his hands gripping the windowsill, his shoulders rigid, and she could see in the reflection of the glass that his eyes were closed, and his jaw was clenched so hard that the muscles stood out like ropes along his neck. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned around, and his face held something she had not seen there before. Relief. The look of a man who has been drowning and someone has finally acknowledged that the water is real. 7 weeks, he said. You've known for 7 weeks, and you didn't run. You didn't go to the police. You didn't try to use it against me. You came back every Sunday, and you sat there and you sketched, and you knew the whole time. She typed. I came back because the light is good for drawing, and because you look like someone who needed a witness, even if you didn't know you had one. Something broke open in his face. Not grief, not rage, but something older than both. Recognition. The recognition that this woman, this deaf tattoo artist who read the world through her eyes, who sat in cemeteries and drew the quiet, who carried his secret without being crushed by it, was someone unlike anyone he had ever met. Why are you telling me now? He asked. She typed, because you just let me write your wife's name on your skin. Because that kind of trust deserves honesty. Because I think you're slowly being destroyed by carrying this alone, and I think you came to my studio not just because I can draw, but because you recognize something in me. Another person who lives in silence. Another person who knows what it's like to carry things that other people can't see. Nikolai looked at her across the studio, this small, fierce woman with the violet-streaked hair and the tattooed forearms and the dark eyes that saw everything, and he felt something move in his chest that had been frozen for 2 years. Not love, not yet, but the precursor to love, the thawing of something that had been sealed in ice since Mara's death, the first tremor of an earthquake that would eventually reshape the entire landscape of his life. Victor will try to kill you if he finds out you know, he said. She typed, Victor doesn't know I exist, and even if he did, he would look at me and see a deaf woman. He would see a limitation, a disability, someone who couldn't possibly be a threat. That's what everyone sees when they look at me. It's the greatest advantage I've ever had. Nikolai studied her, and she could see him recalculating, reevaluating, seeing her not as a civilian who had stumbled into his secret, but as an asset, a person whose perceived limitation was actually a weapon, whose ability to read lips made her a surveillance tool that no technology could replicate. What do you want from me? He asked. She typed, I want you to do the right thing. I want you to find a way to expose Victor that doesn't destroy everything you've built. I want you to stop confessing to the dead and start confessing to the living. And I want you to stop looking at me like I'm either a threat or a tool, because I am neither. I'm a person who drew your face 12 times in the last 7 weeks and is extremely annoyed about it. The last line caught him off guard. His lips parted slightly, and the ghost of a smile that she had seen in the cemetery appeared again, stronger this time, more real, and she felt it in her silent chest like a vibration, like the rumble of distant thunder that she could not hear but could feel in her bones. What followed was not a plan so much as an alliance. It was built on the strange foundation of shared silence. His silence about Victor's crime, her silence about everything. And it grew in the spaces between words, in the looks exchanged across her tattoo studio, in the texts that flew between their phones at all hours, because texting was Nadia's native mode of communication, and Nikolai discovered that he preferred it too, that writing his thoughts forced a precision that speaking did not require. She helped him build a case against Victor, not through violence, not through the methods that his world typically employed, but through information. Nadia's ability to read lips became the key that unlocked everything. She attended meetings that Nikolai arranged in cafes and restaurants, sitting at nearby tables with her sketchbook, invisible in the way that deaf people are often invisible in hearing spaces. And she read the lips of the men Victor met with, the conversations he had when he believed no one who mattered was listening. The first meeting she observed was at a restaurant called Constantine's, a dark paneled place near the waterfront, where men with expensive watches and cheap morals conducted business over plates of food they barely touched. Nikolai had arranged for Victor to meet a contact there, a man named Dmitri, who managed several of Victor's off-the-books accounts. Nadia arrived 20 minutes early, took a corner booth with a clear sightline to the table where the meeting would occur, and ordered coffee and a plate of pastries she had no intention of eating. She opened her sketchbook and began to draw the restaurant's interior, the carved wooden panels, the brass light fixtures, the bottles behind the bar. And when Victor arrived with Dmitri, she simply adjusted her gaze and read. Victor was stocky and broad, with a buzzed head and the restless energy of a man who was always calculating his next move. His lips were thin and precise, and he spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who trusted no one enough to waste words. But Nadia's eyes were sharper than his paranoia. She caught every word, every syllable, every damning admission that fell from his mouth like coins from a torn pocket. He spoke about money being rerouted from the organization's port operations into accounts that only he controlled. He spoke about a weapons shipment that he had diverted for personal profit. And then, leaning closer to Dmitri, lowering his voice to a whisper that he believed made him safe, he said something that turned Nadia's blood to ice in her veins. The Mara situation was clean. No one questioned it then. No one questions it now. Nikolai's too soft to act even if he suspected, which he doesn't. That's the beauty of it. He's so busy grieving, he can't see what's right in front of him. Nadia's pen pressed so hard into the paper that it tore through the page. She kept her face absolutely neutral, her expression fixed in the mild concentration of an artist absorbed in her work, and she committed the words to the photographic memory that had never failed her. Clean. He called the murder of the woman Nikolai loved clean. He sat in a restaurant and ate bread and drank wine and described the assassination of Mara Volkov as if it were a successful business transaction, nothing more than a line item in the ledger of his ambition. She filled notebooks with the words she read, transcriptions of conversations that Victor believed were private. Over the following weeks, she observed 6 more meetings, at cafes, in park squares, once through the window of a private club where Victor held court with his growing network of loyalists. Each transcription added another brick to the wall of evidence, admissions of embezzlement, plans to eventually push Nikolai out entirely, and the casual, chilling references to the thing with Mara that confirmed his guilt in language that would devastate him if it ever came to light. There was one afternoon when the danger became real. Nadia was sitting in a cafe across from a meeting between Victor and 2 men she did not recognize, reading their conversation through the plate glass window, when Victor's gaze swept the street and paused on her. He stared for 4 seconds. She counted them, each second a hammer blow against her rib cage, and she kept drawing, kept her eyes on her sketchbook, kept her expression blank and undisturbed. She felt his attention like a physical weight, like a hand closing around her throat, and she forced herself to breathe, to remain still, to be exactly what she appeared to be. A young woman with a sketchbook and combat boots and a nose ring, sitting in a cafe on a Tuesday afternoon, completely unremarkable. Victor's gaze moved on. He turned back to his associates, and Nadia sat in the aftermath of those 4 seconds and understood with absolute clarity that what she was doing could get her killed, and that she was going to keep doing it anyway. She told Nikolai about the close call that night over text messages that flew between their phones at 2 a.m. He wanted to pull her out immediately. He typed, "This is over. I won't let you risk yourself for this." She typed back, "You don't get to decide what I risk. I'm not one of your soldiers. I'm doing this because it's right, not because you asked me to." The argument lasted an hour, conducted entirely in silence through glowing phone screens, and she won because she was right and he knew it, and because the alternative, losing the only advantage they had against Victor, was unacceptable. Nikolai watched her work with growing admiration and growing fear. Admiration because she was extraordinary at what she did, because her ability to extract information from visual cues alone was more effective than any wiretap or surveillance equipment he had ever used, and fear because every moment she spent in proximity to Victor's world increased the danger to her life. Their relationship deepened in the margins of this operation. Late nights at Silent Ink, Nikolai sitting in the tattoo chair while Nadia worked on other clients, their conversation flowing through her phone screen. Quick, witty, increasingly personal. He learned that she collected vinyl records for their artwork, that she could identify the genre of music by the design of the cover alone, that she had a particular fondness for jazz album art from the 1950s because the graphic design was bold and unapologetic. She learned that he played piano badly in the early morning hours when he could not sleep, pressing the keys and feeling the vibrations through his fingertips, and that he had once told Mara he played well just to impress her and had been faking it for the entirety of their relationship. She learned that he read poetry in Russian, that he could recite Pushkin from memory, that the Cyrillic tattoo across his collarbone was a line from a poem his mother had whispered to him as a child, back before the poverty and the violence and the choices that could not be unchosen. He learned about the specific frequency of her laughter, which she could not hear but which vibrated through her entire body when something genuinely amused her. A full-body experience that began in her stomach and rose through her chest and emerged as a sound she had never heard, but which Nikolai thought was the most honest sound in the world. She learned that when he was moved by something, his scarred lip twitched on the left side, a tell so subtle that only someone trained to read faces would ever catch it. She caught it every time. One evening she was tattooing a client, a young woman getting a geometric mandala on her forearm. And Nikolai was sitting in the waiting area pretending to read a magazine while actually watching Nadia work. The client was nervous, talking fast, and Nadia was doing what she always did, reading the client's lips for relevant information while her hands performed their precise, unhurried work. When the session was over and the client had left, Nikolai came to stand beside her workstation and looked at the fresh tattoo she had just created, the intricate symmetry of it, the way every line was perfectly placed and perfectly spaced. He spoke, and she read. "How do you do that? How do you make something permanent and beautiful while the whole world is talking at you?" She typed, "The world is never talking at me. That's the whole point." He reached for her hand that night across the counter of her studio while they were reviewing transcriptions of Victor's meetings. His fingers found hers, and she let him hold her hand, his scarred knuckles against her ink-stained fingers, and the contact was so charged, so heavy with everything they had not yet said to each other, that they both stayed absolutely still for a full minute, neither pulling away, neither pushing forward, just existing in the electric space between friendship and something more dangerous. She typed with her free hand. "Is this a good idea?" He spoke, and she read, "No, it's a terrible idea, but I can't seem to stop." "Then don't stop." She kissed him 3 days later, It happened in her apartment above the studio, Phantom watching from the bed with the judgmental disinterest that only cats possess. They had been reviewing the latest batch of transcriptions, their phones passing between them like notes in a classroom, and she had looked up from a particularly damning passage about Victor's financial dealings to find Nikolai looking at her with an expression that was no longer ambiguous, no longer deniable, no longer anything other than what it was. She stood up from her chair, crossed the small distance between them, put her ink-stained hands on either side of his face, and kissed him. She could not hear the sound he made, but she felt it. A low vibration that traveled from his chest through his mouth into hers, a sound that was part surprise and part surrender, and part the breaking open of something that had been sealed shut for 2 years. When she pulled back, she typed on her phone. "I've been wanting to do that since the 4th Sunday in the cemetery," he said, and she read, "I've been wanting you to do that since you told me the light was good for drawing and refused to leave." The night they finally exposed Victor, Nadia was not present. Nikolai had insisted on this, had been immovable on the point that when the confrontation happened, she would be somewhere safe, somewhere far from the blast radius of a man discovering that his secrets had been documented by a deaf woman who read lips from across restaurant tables. They argued about it for 2 days. Another silent argument conducted through text messages and heated facial expressions across her studio. And she relented only because he promised to call her the moment it was over, a promise she accepted with the caveat that he could not actually call her because she was deaf and he would need to text, which made him laugh in the way that cracked his composure and showed the man underneath. Nikolai gathered his inner circle, the men and women who had been loyal to him since before Mara's death. In the back room of a warehouse in the industrial district, a space that smelled of concrete and old machinery, and the particular brand of tension that fills a room when powerful people are about to learn something that will change everything. He laid the evidence before them on a steel table, pages of transcribed conversations, organized chronologically, each one dated and annotated in Nadia's precise handwriting. Financial records that Nadia had helped him trace through the labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts that Victor had constructed to hide his theft. The complete picture of Victor's embezzlement, his betrayal, and his murder of Mara Volkov. The room went silent as the men read. Nadia had transcribed the conversations with an accuracy that was almost supernatural. Direct quotes, specific figures, names of contacts, dates of meetings. Every detail was there, laid bare in black ink on white paper, the invisible made visible by a woman who saw what others could not. Victor denied everything. He denied it with the practiced conviction of a man who had been lying for 2 years and had come to believe his own fiction. He looked around the room at the faces of men who had trusted him, men he had shared meals and operations and history with, and he said the words that liars always say, "This is fabricated. Someone is trying to destroy me." But his voice, which Nadia was not there to read, cracked on the word fabricated, and everyone in the room heard it, and everyone understood what that crack meant. The evidence was overwhelming. The transcriptions alone, with their specific details and direct quotes that only someone present at those meetings could have known, made denial impossible. The room understood. The loyalty shifted like tectonic plates, slow and inevitable, and permanently rearranging the landscape. While the confrontation unfolded across the city, Nadia sat in her apartment, above Silent Ink with Phantom in her lap and her phone in her hand, staring at the screen, waiting for the text that would tell her it was over. The apartment was dark except for the glow of the phone and the amber light of the street lamp outside her window. And she sat in her native silence and felt time pass the way she always felt it, through changes in light, through the vibrations of traffic on the street below that she could sense through the building's bones, through the slow deepening of night that pressed against the windows like a living thing. She had drawn Nikolai's face again while she waited, a compulsive habit now, and this time she had drawn him smiling, the real smile, the one that broke through his grief like sunlight through cloud cover. And she looked at the drawing and felt something she could only describe as longing, though the word seemed too small for what she felt. Her phone vibrated at 11:47. One word from Nikolai. "Done," she typed back. "And?" "Victor is in custody. The truth is out. Everyone knows." She stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed, "Are you okay?" The pause before his response lasted 2 full minutes, which was an eternity in the language of text messages. Then, "I don't know. I think I might be free, and I've forgotten what that feels like." She typed, "Come over. I'll make terrible coffee, and you can sit in my tattoo chair and figure it out." "On my way." He arrived at her studio at midnight, still wearing the suit he had worn to the confrontation, and she let him in through the back door and made the terrible coffee she had promised, and they sat together in the dark studio, surrounded by her flash art and her ink bottles, and the faint lingering smell of disinfectant, and he told her everything that had happened, through text messages typed on his phone because his hands were shaking too badly to speak clearly, enough for her to read his lips. She held his hands when the shaking got bad. She held them until they stilled. And when he finally looked up at her with those pale, gray-blue eyes that she had been drawing for weeks, she saw something she had never seen in them before. Peace. Fragile, tentative, new, but unmistakably peace. Victor was removed from the organization that night. Not killed. Nikolai made that choice deliberately, consciously, with Nadia's words echoing through his mind. Do the right thing. Victor was delivered to authorities with enough evidence to ensure he would spend the rest of his life in a cell, and the story that emerged of a man who had killed his best friend's wife and framed an innocent rival reshaped the criminal landscape of the city in ways that Nikolai had spent 2 years fearing, but that turned out to be far less catastrophic than he had imagined. Some alliances fractured, others strengthened. The men who had been loyal to Nikolai became more loyal, because a leader who tells the truth, even when it costs him, is a leader worth following. And the men who had secretly aligned with Victor disappeared into the margins, scattering like shadows when the light is turned on. The truth, it turned out, was not the thing that destroyed empires. Lies were. The lie had been a slow poison, corroding Nikolai from the inside for 2 years, weakening the foundations of everything he had built while appearing to hold it together. The truth was painful and expensive and messy, but it was clean. It was solid ground after 2 years of standing on sand. Nikolai went to the cemetery on a Sunday morning, the first Sunday after Victor's arrest. He drove alone. He walked to Mara's grave. He replaced the white roses this time, the same variety he had always brought, because some rituals are too sacred to change, even when everything else has shifted. And then he knelt in the cold morning air and spoke to the woman he had loved. And this time, the words were different. "I told the truth, Mara. I finally told the truth. Victor is gone. The lie is over. And I need you to know that I didn't do it alone. Someone helped me. Someone saw me when I thought I was invisible, heard me when I thought no one was listening. She can't actually hear, which you would find hilarious, but she hears more than anyone I've ever met." He paused. His hand rested on the headstone. "I think I'm falling in love with her, Mara. And I think you would approve, because she's the kind of woman you always wanted me to find. Someone who sees through the darkness to whatever light is left. Someone who isn't afraid of what I am. Someone who carries her own silence and has turned it into something beautiful." 30 meters away, behind the row of older headstones, Nadia Sorel sat with her sketchbook in her lap and read his lips and felt tears running down her face, dropping onto the paper, blurring the lines of the drawing she had been working on. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall, let them ruin the sketch, because some things were worth more than keeping the page clean. She stood up. She closed her sketchbook, tucked her pen behind her ear the way she always did when she was done working, and she walked across the cemetery, across the 30 meters of ground that had separated them for 9 Sundays. Across the invisible boundary between watching and participating, between witnessing a man's grief from a safe distance and choosing to step into the messy, dangerous, beautiful reality of his life. Her combat boots crunched on the gravel path, and even though she could not hear the sound, she felt the vibration of each step through her soles, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, steady and sure and moving forward. She stood beside him at Mara's grave, and she looked at the black marble headstone with the white flowers and the name of a woman she had never met, but felt she knew intimately. She knew Mara through Nikolai's words, the woman who had challenged him at a gallery opening, who had seen through the armor to the man underneath, who had held his sins without flinching, who had loved him with the kind of fierce, clear-eyed devotion that demanded he become better than he was. She knew Mara through the grief she had left behind, through the flowers replaced every Sunday, through the confession that a powerful man delivered to cold marble because the truth was too heavy to carry alone. She knew Mara, and she respected her, and she understood that loving Nikolai did not mean replacing the woman who had come before, but rather joining a story that was already in progress, adding her own chapter to a narrative that Mara had begun. She typed on her phone and held it out to him. She would definitely approve. I'm excellent. Nikolai read the screen and laughed. Actually laughed. A real laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine, a sound that emerged from a place he had forgotten existed, a laugh that she could not hear but could feel vibrating through the cemetery air like the ringing of a bell. His whole face changed when he laughed. The grief lines softened, the sharp angles became gentler, and for a moment he looked like the man Mara must have fallen in love with at that gallery opening, before the violence and the loss and the lies had calcified around him. The sound, the silent sound, was the most beautiful thing Nadia had ever not heard. He took her hand. She let him. His fingers intertwined with hers, scarred knuckles against ink-stained skin, the wedding band on his left hand cool against her finger, and neither of them moved to let go. They stood together at the grave of the woman he had loved, in the quiet of a cemetery on a hillside, two people who had found each other through silence and secrets, and the extraordinary intimacy of being truly seen. The morning light fell across them, catching the frost on the surrounding headstones and turning the cemetery into something that looked less like a place of death and more like a place of beginning. Phantom the cat, who had stowed away in the basket of Nadia's bicycle as he sometimes did on these Sunday excursions, jumped onto the low wall beside Mara's grave and sat there with his tail curled around his paws, watching them with the impassive approval of a creature who had always known this was where the story was heading. Thank you so much for staying with Nadia and Nikolai through every twist of this story. Thank you for understanding that silence can be a superpower, that the truth is always worth telling even when it costs you everything, and that love can grow in the strangest and most unexpected places. If this story moved you, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being different is not being less. I read every comment, and your words keep these stories alive. Until next time, remember, the people who see the most are often the ones the world overlooks. Be the person who looks back.